Venezuela, it's goodbye to the United Socialist Party as the opposition is now in power following a landslide vote. But what does this mean for the ailing South American country moving forwards? Could this be a turning point for what has long been considered the world's worst economy? Joining me to discuss is Edward Glossop from Capital Economics. Edward, it's been 16 years of mismanagement and economic woes, so could the democratic unity be the tonic the country needs to get its economy back on track?
I think in the near term, obviously we've had Argentina's elections recently and they've heralded this big shift in economic policy. I think Venezuela's elections are very different. For a start, they were only legislative. So in other words, while the opposition is now in power of the legislature, President Nicolas Maduro, who is the PSUV leader, is still the president. So they still have this big stumbling block to overcome before they can announce some big changes in economic policy.
What's the economic situation today in Venezuela and what's the main sticking points?
It's very difficult to say what the economic situation is, simply because the government don't publish any hard economic data in any timely fashion. So we've had no economic data since the third quarter of last year. But looking at low profile indicators which we tend to track, the economy is contracting by about 10%, which is the worst performance in the world.
So democratic unity's policies moving forwards, there's no green shoots there?
Well, this is part of the problem. Of course, it's a green shoot, but it's a long-term green shoot. This is going to trigger a political transition that in the medium term is going to be very beneficial to the economy. But in the near term, it's just going to trigger political instability and a big power struggle between the legislature and the president. Of course, the policies that are needed are very, very wide-ranging. They need to tighten fiscal and monetary policy, lift capital controls, unify exchange rates. The legislature has not proposed any credible economic policy. As such, they have simply traded off the unpopularity of the government rather than off of good policies themselves. So it's difficult to know at this stage what their economic agenda might be.
Well, I've spoken to a lot of Venezuelans and they seem very upbeat about this new political party coming into power. So when do you think they will start seeing any changes in the economy?
It's going to be long-term, 2-3 years. We're going to have a big power struggle between the National Assembly, so the legislature, and the president. Now, in April next year, we might have what's called a popular referendum to remove the president because he's in his halfway term. So we could see the ousting of the president. We could see the president maybe start a coup as he did in 2002-3. We could have general strikes if he refuses to leave. This is going to get very, very messy before it gets better.
So I was going to ask, is this now a good time for foreign investment? But I imagine they should probably now wait until that's resolved.
Exactly. Bond yields have really rallied since the opposition took to power, and that's remarkable given the slide in the oil price. Venezuelan assets tend to move in lockstep with the oil price given the economy's dependence on oil. But they've rallied since the opposition victory, and that's very, very short-lived in our view, given the political turmoil that's about to erupt.
Why is the economy so bad? What's put it in this position in the first place?
The proximate cause of the current crisis has been the drop in global oil prices. We're now at below $40. The underlying cause has been severe macroeconomic mismanagement for the past decade under Hugo Chavez and then President Nicolas Maduro. They've imposed price controls, they've imposed foreign exchange controls, so companies can't import, they can't export without strict regulatory requirements. Macroeconomic policy has been too loose, so the central bank will tend to print money to simply finance the budget deficit, which of course exacerbates a huge inflation problem. We estimate inflation is running about 200%, so prices are increasing 200% year on year. So that's eroding Venezuelans' real incomes, which of course is one of the key reasons why they've kicked out the party from the legislature.
Well, like I said before, there does seem to be this really good sentiment surrounding the recent election. But it strikes me a little bit like the Greek situation when Syriza got in power. Everyone were really happy that this was going to be the change the country really needed to move it forwards. But do you think this will be perhaps like Greece and they won't actually make any difference even if they oust the president?
There's some truth in that. I think obviously we have this euphoria right now, which everyone is obviously, on the ground, everyone is really optimistic about the future now because we're seeing an end to the PSUV. The start of the long-term decline of so-called Chavismo, the PSUV dominance in Venezuela. But in the very nearer term implications, it's very difficult to see any positive scenario in the near term. And so, yeah, it's very much like the Greek situation.
So do you think this election will have any knock-on effects for other South American countries?
The obvious point to make there is that we've seen the trend of Argentina's obviously socialist party has been kicked out. We've seen Venezuela, similar situation. If President Maduro leaves, then the new coalition could then have their own president run for re-election because we trigger fresh presidential elections. We've also got the Brazilian case where President Dilma is on the verge of being impeached, or an impeachment process is underway. And so that could trigger the end of her left-wing coalition. And so there is a trend in the region for a decline of the general centre-left parties and an uprising of more sort of centrist, centre-right parties.
And do you think this trend could perhaps be blamed on low commodities, or is there something else there?
Very much so. I think it's a general decline in sentiment because a lot of these political parties have mismanaged economic resources. So over the past decade, where we've had high and rising commodity prices, many of these governments have simply spent that windfall instead of saving, like other parts of the emerging world. Now that the times are less good, commodity prices have fallen, they have no fallback, they have no savings to draw upon to continue to finance consumption like you would in a standard economy.